Paint Care is all about keeping it simple for district residents. They make recycling leftover paint easy with convenient locations like your local paint store. Paint Care has 3 simple rules for painting smarter and reducing waste. 1, buy the right amount of paint for the job. 2, use up what's left. And 3, recycle the rest. To learn more or find a paint drop site near you, visit paintcare.org/3simplerules. That's paintcare.org/3simplerules.
Today on CityCast DC, I get to sit down with one of my favorite guests, my fellow CityCast host, Bridget Todd. Bridget grew up being taken to jazz shows around DC by her dad. This made her the city's littlest jazz enthusiast. She's been thinking a lot about the subject since her dad passed away. And today we're going to talk through the history and the present of jazz in the district and how you can experience it like she did. Today is Tuesday, June 10th. I'm Michael Schaffer, and here's what DC's talking about. Hey, Bridget.
Hey, Mike. How's it going?
I'm good. So I'm really glad we're doing this because you are going to teach me and all our listeners how to be a good DC jazz fan.
I hope so. I don't know that I'm like the expert, but it is something I have a little bit of familiarity with. So hopefully I can sort of get folks on the right. If you're interested in jazz in DC and exploring what DC has to offer in terms of jazz, hopefully I can like at least set people in the right direction.
Well, so tell us about your journey, because this is actually a very sweet and personal story for you.
It is. I mean, like all niche interests, it was passed down to me by my father, like all niche interests that like youth get involved in. My late father spent a lot of time in DC. He was a huge fan of live jazz, specifically like live jazz performed around DC. And so I really grew up in DC's jazz clubs. Like literally I would be like an 8-year-old girl in a dark jazz club on U Street. I grew up in those clubs, really. Wow.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, what could go wrong? I mean,
how did they treat you as an 8-year-old girl?
Oh, everyone loved it. I have so many, like, my mom wasn't a big jazz fan, so I was, like, generally my father's, like, quote, date to these clubs.
Uh-huh.
And, like, this is so silly, but, like, he always wore a black leather beret when he was going to a jazz club. So, like, I had a little black leather beret, and people...
That's pretty adorable.
It was adorable. There's like literally pictures of me like at 8 wearing a black leather beret in a jazz club. I'm not totally sure that it was legal to have kids in nightclubs in DC, but I think when you've got like an 8-year-old in a black leather beret trying to see some jazz, man, I think they look the other way. I think
the owners not want to mess with that.
Yeah, the owners look the other way.
So I think of my own children, or maybe myself when I was a child, as way too ADHD to like sit through a jazz show. But you were cool with it.
I actually think, so I also was a child who had ADHD. I actually think jazz is a style of music that actually would be good because it like, from where a note starts, you never know where it's going to end. And it's like quite like loud. And it's like, yeah, I loved it. I wasn't like faking my way through it to please my dad. I really enjoyed it. And like, I loved being in these spaces full of adults who seemed like cool and kind of like counterculture. So if you're thinking about taking an 8-year-old to a jazz club, I cannot speak to the legality of that, but I think they would have a good time.
Wait, so let's nerd out about the DC piece of this. So DC, I think of DC as one of the epicenters, one of the capitals of Black American culture. It is the home of Howard University. It has this long tradition of political leadership, intellectual leadership. I don't think of it as like one of the big jazz cities of the United States. I think of New York, I think of New Orleans. Am I wrong in that?
You are a little bit wrong. So you're right in that jazz originated in New Orleans. And it's really a style of music that is like deeply, directly connected to the Black American experience. And because DC has always been this major city for Black folks, as you said, DC was really vital in terms of like the early movement of jazz taking hold. And back in the day, DC was deeply segregated, but this was also during Prohibition. So like U Street became this home of like a couple thousand speakeasies where you could go drink illegally and also hear live jazz performed. And so a lot of historians actually credit that with helping integrate DC between black and white because everybody wanted to come to these clubs and drink liquor and hear jazz music. And so that's kind of like one of the reasons why DC, particularly U Street, but other areas in the city really were integral to the early days of jazz, but also the early roots of jazz in DC.
And obviously, like a lot of very famous musicians played those clubs. Who does DC claim as someone who's not just who was born or raised here, but whose sort of music took root here and who formed their first bands here? I know we've got the Ellington Bridge, but
Yes.
I don't always associate with his music with DC. Maybe I'm wrong in that too.
Well, he was born in DC, and like, just to be clear, like when you're on U Street and you see murals dedicated to jazz, it's because U Street was known as Black Broadway, and like U Street was and always has been sort of DC's standout jazz area. They had so many clubs where so many famous folks, names that you probably know, performed. There's the Lincoln Theater, which opened back in 1921 and was really a focal point for jazz on U Street. It served the black community in DC during segregation. Duke Ellington performed there, so like very famous. What was known as the Music Hall, which is now 930 Club, Ella Fitzgerald performed there, Cab Calloway performed there, Lionel Hampton and his orchestra performed there. Bohemian Caverns is a place that I have a little bit of a soft spot for. I know they had to close maybe it was around 10 years ago they closed kind of under unfortunate circumstances. But that
a girl with a black beret was caught there, and the cops said no more.
An 8-year-old in a black beret. But that club was like really known for Washington's sort of elite to see Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and fun fact about that spot, in 1959, Tony Taylor and Angelo Alvino bought the club and really turned it into like DC's premier spot. They booked folks in the 60s like Miles Davis, Nina Simone, Charles Mingus, John Coltrane, all of these like huge names. And in 1964, Ramsey Lewis recorded the critically and commercially successful album, the Ramsey Lewis Trio, at Bohemian Caverns. And so I don't know what Bohemian Caverns is now, but I remember going there with my dad to hear jazz being performed on the night of Obama's first election, right? So like it was a mainstay on the area in terms of jazz in DC.
Get ready for DC's most intoxicating theater experience yet. Gala Theater presents the world premiere adaptation of Botiquín de Boleros, an immersive cabaret-style musical that takes audiences on a nostalgic journey through love, breakup, and self-love. You're not just watching, you'll be stepping into the Columbia Heights Bolero Bar, where patrons share stories of broken hearts through boleros spanning from Mexico to the Caribbean to South America. The show runs June 11th to 29th. Tickets are going fast. Find more info and get yours at galatheater.org. That's GALATHEATRE.org. Picture this. You're sipping café au lait at a Parisian sidewalk bistro, effortlessly chatting with locals who are impressed by your French. That fantasy can become your reality when you join the Alliance Française of Washington, D.C. Alliance Française isn't just a language school. It's a whole French cultural experience with exclusive events like wine tastings, film nights, art talks, and more. Summer classes start July 7th. Whether you're a total beginner or practically fluent, they've got courses to make sure you're confident in your French before your next European adventure. Enroll by June 20th, and you'll save $20 on tuition. Just head to francedc.org. That's francedc.org. So talk about how this changed. Like you painted this great picture of the Prohibition era where people would go to speakeasies. It was a rare place of white people and black people socially being in the same space, even if they weren't necessarily at the same table. After World War II, the culture changes. Jazz is not quite as central as it was. And DC changes, right? There's white flight, there's, social segregation is still a constant, but who's here and where they are here changes. How did the DC jazz world change with it?
Yeah, I mean, like so much of DC, sort of general urban decline in the 60s to the 80s related to the riots after MLK's assassination, and then just like general economic shifts. So then all of these clubs that were having this like heyday closed down as that whole U Street area was really undergoing just like decline. You also had like go-go becoming more popular and sort of shifting DC's cultural soundscape. And so like, at a time when you thought about the sound of Black DC, it was jazz. Around the like 1980s, that was becoming replaced with go-go, which is a style of music I also love. I don't want to make it seem like I'm like anti-go-go.
Right. But, like a friend of CityCast and of me, Brianna Thomas, wrote this book of pictures of old U Street. And you look at these pictures of jazz clubs from the 20s and stuff, and everyone's dressed really nicely because the culture was such that you got dressed up nice to go out in those days. By the 80s, there's been riots. U Street is being dug up for the metro. It's a much, much rougher place. And the sort of, again, the culture of like, let's go to a nice place and act fancy because we're on a date and we'll watch some jazz. Like that culture has shifted in music. And I guess DC shifted with it.
Exactly. And so there was still like an undercurrent of jazz in the city during this time, but it wasn't like what you described, like getting dressed up to go see, a night of good jazz. It was like smaller, more intimate venues or, jazz really being upheld by academic institutions like Howard University, right? Like,
which is kind of like putting it in a museum.
Exactly, exactly.
No disrespect to academics, but when the academics celebrate something, it tends to be maybe a little bit after it's at its most vital point.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And then you mentioned U Street being dug up for the metro. In the 90s, there really was this renewed interest in jazz and the preservation of that legacy, specifically in DC. And I think part of it really was like revitalizing and boosting U Street that happened in the 90s, when they put in the metro and they built the Reeves Center in 1986, so like late 80s. The Department of Housing and Urban Development having these like Remembering U Street grants, which like put up historic properties and improved dilapidated storefronts along U and 14th. Like all of that was really integral to sort of the revival of jazz that we saw in the late 80s and early 90s as part of a revival of U Street in general.
So bring us up to today. What if you're going to go out to watch jazz, if you were to take me out, I would wear a leather beret. Where would you take me? And would I be mocked?
Well, you might be mocked for the beret, although I think the beret is coming back. Like my dad passed away in November, and my dad was like he was my guy. Like he was my like, everything cool about me was like planted in me by my dad. I'll put it that way.
I'm going to say I didn't know your dad, but I know you've talked about him. I expect he could pull some stuff off that maybe Mike Schaffer could not.
I would agree with that. Although I have to say, it's so funny that you say this. I've actually thought before, my dad would have loved you. I wish that y'all had gotten to me because he would have really gotten a kick out of you for sure. So like one of the spots for jazz in DC, which I spent my youth in, I was there when it opened in 2000. Unfortunately, it did not survive the pandemic, but Twins Jazz, like if we had been doing this interview pre-pandemic, that would have been the spot. So like RIP to Twins. It was opened by these two Ethiopian sisters. It survived in DC for like 30 years almost, and then it closed during the pandemic. It wasn't even supposed to have jazz. It was these two sisters just wanted to open an Ethiopian restaurant. They started booking jazz performers, and eventually it was named one of the top 100 jazz clubs in the world by Downbeat magazine. It was teeny tiny, and that made it great because like you could really hear the music and really like feel the music. So that's where I would take you if it had not closed down. But I wanted to shout it out quickly because it was such a special spot to me.
What about other places that we go right now?
So right now, a couple of good spots to go to are JoJo's. It was actually the last place I ever saw jazz with my dad before he passed away. JoJo's is good. I will say for people go to these spots because they want to hear good jazz music. JoJo's has excellent food, but you don't really go to some of these spots for the service, if that makes sense. So just like keep that in mind, that the reason why these places are like thriving is not because they're providing excellent service. They're providing jazz at a time where jazz clubs are, there are not that many of them. So keep that in mind if you go to any of these spots. JoJo's, the vibe is great. They always have good performers. I will say about JoJo's, make reservations. JoJo's is at 1518 U Street Northwest. So like it is a great spot, but it's tiny. And so if you don't make reservations, they might put you upstairs where you're like watching the performance. Like you're not even really watching the performance. So don't assume like who is going to see jazz on a Saturday night. I can certainly get in there with no reservation. No, you can't make reservations.
Where else is big right now?
I would say Mr. Henry's in Capitol Hill. That spot's a little bit more neighborhoody. Like it is definitely like the crowd is older. You're there to like really see a legit jazz performance, that's where I would send you. I actually enjoy the food, but again, I wouldn't be going there because I'm expecting like stellar service. If you were interested in like an upscale, kind of good for a date spot to see some jazz, I might send you to St. Vincent's Wine Bar. They do jazz. Dynamite service, fancier place, but like that would be where I would send you if you were like looking to impress your date with your knowledge of jazz and wine. Do you love dining out as much as I do? Then you need to check out the In Kind app. With In Kind, you can find the best restaurants, bars, and cafes right here in DC and all across the country. And get this, every time you dine out, you earn 20% back in dining credits to use for next time. That's right, you're getting rewarded just for eating at amazing places. The best part, it's completely free to download and create an account. And when you're ready to pay your bill, just do it right through the app. It's super easy to use and it's a total no-brainer. Because you're a CityCast listener, we've got an exclusive deal just for you. $25 off your bill of $50 or more, redeemable at any location on the InKind app. Just head to inkind.vip/DC. That's inkind.vip/DC.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
So tell me, like, what's the scene like? Like, who's in the crowd? You know, I think of jazz now as like, you know, it's not like it's a totally obscure form of music, but it is by no means like the kind of mainstream, you know, I think most culturally literate people probably can't name many sort of currently active jazz musicians. So is it like old people? Is it like just like impossibly smart young people who I can't relate to? Who's there?
So this is why I love going to see jazz in DC, because it is such a diverse crowd. You get older folks, you get Black folks, you get like sort of young, hip white folks. It is just a really interesting crowd to be in. And I think it's a crowd that really reflects DC, because jazz is, unfortunately, a niche interest. And so the kind of people who are brought to see jazz or like inspired to go see jazz on a Saturday night, like those are the kind of folks who are maybe a little bit offbeat. And I love that.
What are they wearing? I mean, is it like, do I need to wear a beret for one? And beyond that, can I show up looking like a schlub?
I mean, I wouldn't say there's a dress code. I mean, definitely come as you are. But a lot of jazz clubs are frequented by older Black folks, right? And y'all know how older Black folks can be like. So you should be able to feel comfortable with whatever you're wearing. But don't be surprised when like there's an older Black auntie in like head to toe fancy garments, if that makes sense.
That would upscale my evening by my average evening so much.
And if you're looking for like a lower key spot to just hear some jazz, they do have jazz at Mark's Cafe in Mount Pleasant, 10 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. every Tuesday. That is like a very accessible, easy entrance way to just experience some jazz in a more sort of low key setting.
And you can just walk in, no reservations.
I've heard some talk of there maybe is a cover now, but I cannot confirm that myself. But the times I've been, you can just like drop in and hear some good jazz, like very accessible.
So how do they, I mean, if you're not paying at the door, I'm curious how the performers are getting paid. And for that matter, who are the performers? I guess this is probably not a thing where you can quit your day job anymore.
That's a good question. I mean, I have definitely seen, like, if you go to spots like Blues Alley, like, that is a legitimate club for, like, jazz professionals, like, touring musicians. So there are definitely people who are making a very good living as professional musicians. Maybe they're not, like, selling their trio that has their first name as the name of the band. Maybe they're doing backing for other performers and things like that. But there are certainly people who are making a living, you know, as full-time professional jazz musicians in the United States. I get the sense that maybe that is a dwindling pursuit, just by the way, the music industry is shaped. But there are definitely, like, if you want to see, like, a professional performer who has probably been touring worldwide, definitely check out Blues Alley.
So what's the future here? You said Twins had closed. I know for any kind of night spot, whether it's music or not, it's a really tough, thin margins industry. But is there a sense of threat against the places that are still doing jazz?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a bittersweet question. Jazz was so integral to DC and Black DC. It makes me sad that a lot of these iconic places to see jazz in DC have closed. And Mike, I know that we were talking about this once, how like luxury apartment buildings will spring up in DC with names like the Ellington or like the Vaughn. And it's like kind of an empty nod to like what was once there. That is absolutely happening when it comes to DC jazz clubs, where a jazz club will close, become condos, and the condo name will harken back to its jazz roots. But it's like, well, you're kind of displacing the jazz club that was there. Condo. Yes, exactly. However, I do think that DC is still a solid jazz city. Like, if you wanted to see a night of jazz, there are places to do that in DC. Before my dad died, he was notorious for, my parents lived in Richmond before they passed away recently. And, my dad would call me up from the interstate being like, hey, what are you doing tonight? I'm riding up to DC for jazz. Book some tickets, and then hang up. And so then it was my job to be like, okay, well, who's playing? And there was always something playing, right? And so like, I never had a trouble finding a last minute place to see some really good jazz music in DC. And we have things like the DC Jazz Festival that are really doing the work of keeping jazz in the district alive. So I will say, even as a lot of the places to see jazz in DC have closed because of things like rent and just like the business of urban life in general, DC is still a very solid jazz city.
But before we stop, what's the DC Jazz Festival?
So DC's Jazz Fest is Labor Day weekend. It's August 27th through the 31st, 2025. They've got a pretty good lineup here. Branford Marsalis, who is like a very famous musician. The Sun Ra Orchestra, which I've actually seen multiple times in DC, and it's phenomenal. So yeah, if folks are interested in the DC Jazz Fest, definitely check it out, because this lineup actually looks pretty sick.
Well, Bridget, I hope you will bring me out with you.
Oh, anytime. I've got a beret with your name on it.
I'll see you later.
Thanks, Mike.
Before we go, we got a couple of shout outs from CityCast DC neighbors. Marissa C. is showing love to her local coffee shop, La Coupe. She says it's a great addition to Kennedy Street. Emily R. wants to shout out the Free DC Project for being a unifying force amongst the mayhem in DC over the past couple months. And Kevin P. wants you to know the Bike House will fix your bike for free. On Saturdays, they're at Ace Hardware in Petworth from 12 to 3 p.m. Sundays, they're at Ace Hardware in Brookland. Thanks, Marissa, Emily, and Kevin. Want to share your favorite local business or nonprofit on the pod? Become a CityCast DC neighbor and send us your shout out. We'll read it right here. Join today at membership.citycast.fm. That's membership.citycast.fm. That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why don't you riff about it next time you're playing a solo? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye. I think I'm going to be one of the backing members of the Bridget Todd trio.
That would make my late father very happy.
I am to please.